The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The street smelled of gunpowder and autumn leaves, and something older than both. It was the kind of smell that didn't belong in a London side street at 1 a.m, the kind that settled in the back of the throat and refused to leave. Sirius Black stood in the center of it, his boots on broken cobblestone, his hand wrapped in the collar of Peter Pettigrew's robes, and he was not laughing. He had thought, in the months since James and Lily went into hiding, that if this moment ever came, the moment of confrontation, of reckoning, of the thing that had been building since the night Peter's name came off the list of possible traitors and back onto it, he would feel something clean. Rage, perhaps, the kind that moves in a straight line. What he felt instead was cold. Absolute and specific and very, very focused. Peter was mid-transformation. Had been mid-transformation for 4 seconds now. The left hand had already begun to compress, fingers shortening, knuckles re-knitting themselves into the small, neat fist of a rat's forepaw. The right hand remained human, scrabbling at Sirius's grip with bitten fingernails and the particular desperation of a man who has spent his entire life relying on escape and is discovering, for the first time, that it isn't available. It wasn't available because of the rigiditas sanguinis. Sirius had cast it in the same breath as he'd crossed the street. 2 seconds before Peter opened his mouth to begin the theater of accusation he'd been rehearsing. The Black family's proprietary bloodlock jinx didn't announce itself. It didn't produce light or sound. It simply arrived in the blood, in the muscles and the animal instincts beneath them, and it said, "Still." The transformation reflex stopped. Peter's left hand hung in the air between them, half rat, half man, caught in the architecture of a change that his body could no longer complete. His eyes were very wide. He was making a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Don't," Sirius said. His voice was level in a way that cost him something. "Don't talk yet. I want you to understand something before you talk." Peter understood nothing. He was crying, which was characteristic. "James is dead," Sirius said. "Lily is dead. Harry is alive because of something his mother did that you don't have the capacity to understand, and you are going to stand here and be very, very still, and when the ministry arrives, and they are coming, Peter, because this street is going to have every Muggle emergency service in the borough here in 4 minutes, you are going to confess. Under Veritaserum. Tonight, Sirius, I said don't talk." Peter talked anyway. That was always the thing about Peter. He could never stop talking when silence was the only option that would help him. He talked about fear and power and inevitability and the fact that Voldemort would have found them anyway, that it was already over, that Sirius had to understand. He said the word understand 3 times, which was characteristic too. Peter had always believed that if he could just make you understand, you would agree with him, and he had never grasped that the problem was never comprehension. Sirius stood in the street and listened to all of it. Then the ministry aurors arrived, 4 of them through a crack of apparition that scattered the gathering crowd of confused Muggle neighbors, and Sirius turned to the lead officer. A young man named Proudfoot, with the look of someone who had not yet decided whether this night was remarkable or catastrophic, and invoked, word for word and clause for clause, Section 12 of the Wizengamot Procedural Code. "Noble House matter," he said, producing from his inner pocket an identification document that Proudfoot stared at for 3 full seconds. The Potters were under the secret keeping of House Black. Peter Pettigrew is the true secret keeper. I want Veritaserum administered, and the session witnessed. Now, not tomorrow. Not after you've filed the paperwork. Now, Proudfoot looked at Peter. At the half-transformed hand, at the identification document, which bore the Black family seal in silver wax, and the kind of historical weight that made junior ministry officials instinctively defer. He sent for Veritaserum. The session lasted 40 minutes. A ministry obliviator was stationed at the street's perimeter to manage the Muggle emergency responders. The gas main provided convenient explanation for the rubble, for the crater, for the smell. Peter Pettigrew, under Veritaserum, administered in a ministry-grade dose that allowed for no ambiguity and no omission, confessed to the following, that he had been a spy for Lord Voldemort since the second year of the First Wizarding War, that he had volunteered the secret-keeping role and then suggested, at the last possible moment, a switch, so that if the Potters were found, suspicion would fall on Sirius. That he had delivered the address of Godric's Hollow to Voldemort on the night it happened. That James Potter had been the first to die because he ran toward the sound at the door rather than away from it, and that this was exactly the kind of thing James Potter would do, and that Peter had known it would happen this way. He said all of this in the flat, effectless voice of a man who cannot choose his words. 5 Aurors and 1 ministry observer signed the transcript before midnight. By the time the first gray light began to suggest itself at the horizon, Sirius Black had 3 certified copies of the testimony, a solicitor who had been woken from sleep and arrived looking deeply irritated and deeply competent, and a formal exoneration hearing scheduled for 9 o'clock that morning. He sat in the back of a ministry transport vehicle, one of the certified copies in his hands, and did not sleep. He was thinking about James. Specifically, about a Tuesday afternoon in their 5th year when James had stood in the center of the Gryffindor common room and performed a series of increasingly impossible transfigurations just to make Sirius laugh. He'd had the specific expression he always wore when he was showing off for someone he loved, which was different from showing off in general. Less performance, more gift. The way he'd glance sideways to check whether it was landing, and then the grin when it was, quick and private and not for anyone else in the room. Sirius thought about this for the full length of the journey, and then, when the transport stopped, put it away somewhere he would be able to find it again later, when he had time to fall apart properly. He had a hearing to attend. He had a child to collect. The Wizengamot exonerated Sirius Orion Black before noon. He was 21 years old. He walked out of the ministry building into a gray London afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment, breathing the air of a city that had no particular opinion about what had just happened to him. Around him, London went about its business, people with briefcases, a bicycle courier shouting at a taxi, a woman wrestling an umbrella into submission outside a coffee shop. None of it had any awareness that something had just been corrected. The city was indifferent in the specific way that made it, sometimes, easier to exist inside than the other kind. He hailed a cab, because the Muggle world was sometimes more navigable than the other kind, and he had always known how to live in both. He had one stop before Privet Drive. Godric's Hollow looked the way places look when something terrible has taken up residence, and then left. The house was partially standing. The upper floor had collapsed inward, the roof open to the November sky. The walls below it still holding by the specific stubbornness of old construction. Someone had put a spell over the perimeter, one of the ministry's standard contamination wards, but the ward was thin, and he walked through it without any particular effort. He didn't go into the ground floor. He already knew what he would find there. And he knew, too, that going in would cost him something he needed to keep for later. He climbed what remained of the staircase, which held him through some combination of structural luck and magic that hadn't fully dissipated yet, and moved through the ruins of the upper hallway until he found what he was looking for. The cloak was beneath a collapsed beam. It had been folded, which told him James had it out and folded when it happened. It was undamaged. It was the most undamaged thing in the house, which was perhaps the point of it. Which was perhaps the thing the cloak had always been, a preservation against the inevitable, held against the dark. Sirius held it in both hands for a moment. The fabric was impossibly light for what it was. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that James didn't already know, wherever James was, and Sirius had no gift for speaking to absences. He folded the cloak again, tucked it inside his jacket, and climbed back down the stairs. He did not look at the ground floor as he left. Number 4. Privet Drive was exactly as terrible as he had expected. It was the kind of house that had been designed by someone with a very specific understanding of respectability, meaning that every visible surface communicated effort, and every invisible one communicated the complete absence of it. The garden was neat, in the way that shouted about the neatness rather than simply being it. The curtains in the front window were the particular shade of beige that represented a decision made to avoid making a decision. There were garden ornaments. There was a hanging basket, empty now in November, that had the air of something that would be carefully maintained in spring and pointed to as evidence of character. The man who answered the door was large and purple-faced and wearing the expression of someone who had been told something recently that he deeply wished he hadn't been told, and was now trying to arrange his face around this information. Albus Dumbledore was already there. Of course he was. Sirius had expected this. He had not expected, precisely, to find Dumbledore in the Dursley living room with a cup of tea he wasn't drinking, and the expression of a man who has made a decision so thoroughly that he has come to believe the decision made itself. But here they were. "Sirius," Dumbledore said. "Professor." He hadn't called him that in 3 years. He used it now, deliberately, because it established something about the nature of this conversation, that Sirius was not a former student come to ask a favor, but a man who had arrived with documentation and a position. "I've come for Harry. I suspected you might. Then you'll have read the will. I have. Then you know James named me primary guardian. The exoneration came through this morning. I have the documentation." He produced it, set it on the arm of the nearest chair, because he was not going to hand it to Dumbledore like a supplicant. "This is not a discussion about whether Harry leaves with me. That's settled. What we're discussing is the blood wards." Vernon Dursley, in the corner of the room, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Sirius did not look at him. "The blood wards," Dumbledore said, and his voice had the quality it always had when he was choosing precisely how much to say, "are Lily's greatest legacy to her son. You understand the mechanism. I understand it well enough to know it doesn't require Harry to live here." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "The ward," Sirius continued, "requires Harry to remain within the sphere of influence of Lily's blood anchor, Petunia Dursley. The sphere of influence, by any reasonable interpretation of sacrifice anchor magic, is spatial, not cohabitation, proximity. That is a generous interpretation of the ward mechanics. I've already been in contact with the Gringotts Cursebreakers. They agree with me. The proximity threshold is the operative mechanism, not the address." Something shifted in Dumbledore's eyes. Not agreement. Not yet. But the quality of a man who is recognizing that he is in a conversation with someone who has done their homework, who has spent the hours since the exoneration hearing not celebrating or grieving or sleeping, but preparing for exactly this room. "What exactly?" Dumbledore said carefully. "Are you proposing?" "I'm buying the house next door." Silence. From upstairs, coming through the ceiling of this aggressively ordinary Surrey living room, came the sound of a baby laughing at something only he could see. It was an uncomplicated sound, pure and specific and entirely unaware of the conversation happening beneath it. Both men looked at the ceiling at the same moment. "I'm not leaving him here, Professor," Sirius said. "I won't do it. You can argue the wards at me all you like, but I will not leave James's son in this house with these people." He didn't look at the Dursleys when he said this. He didn't need to. Number 6. It's available. I'll have the deed transferred by the end of the week. I'll layer Black family wards over the existing Lily matrix. The Gringotts team believes the two systems will interact, expand the sphere of influence to cover the whole street. Possibly, Harry stays inside Lily's protection. I have legal custody. And you, he said, very evenly get to sleep knowing I'm next door, which should address your concern about the boy's safety." Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Sirius looked back. He had been in a room with Albus Dumbledore's full attention before, and had learned at 16 that the way to meet it was to not look away from it. Not defiantly. Simply as a person who had as much right to be in the room as anyone else. "You were always," Dumbledore said at last, "exceptionally difficult to outmaneuver. James used to say that too." The name landed in the room and stayed there for a moment, occupying the space between them with the specific weight of something that both men were carrying and neither was going to put down. "Very well," Dumbledore said quietly. "But Sirius, I want quarterly check-ins. My own. And I want your word that Harry will not be made a soldier before he has had the chance to be a child." Sirius considered this. "You have my word that I will raise him to be capable of protecting himself and the people he loves. Whether that constitutes soldiering is a matter of perspective." It was not the word Dumbledore asked for. They both knew it. Dumbledore nodded anyway. Harry was 14 months old and regarded Sirius from the center of the Dursley living room floor with the particular gravity of a person who is not yet entirely sure what the world is, but is very serious about learning. He had his mother's eyes, Lily's eyes, green and precise and paying full attention. He had James's hair, already unruly, already committing to its own direction with no apparent interest in anyone else's opinion. He had a mark on his forehead in the shape of a bolt of lightning that made Sirius's chest do something he wasn't prepared for. A sudden interior movement that was not quite grief and not quite love, and was, he suspected, both of those things simultaneously. "Hello," Sirius said, sitting on the floor because that seemed correct. "I'm Sirius. I know that's not a sentence that means anything to you yet. It will." Harry considered him with the thoroughness of someone conducting an assessment. Then he reached out and grabbed Sirius's finger with both hands and held on with the concentrated grip of someone who has decided that this particular thing is worth keeping. Sirius looked at this small person who was all that remained of the two people he had loved most in the world, and he thought, "I am not going to get this right. I am 21 years old, and I have no idea what I'm doing, and I am absolutely going to make mistakes that cost this child something. But I will be there. I will always, always be there." He lifted Harry carefully, the way he'd been shown in a panicked 10-minute lesson from Lily months ago, when she'd briefly handed the baby over to answer the door. And he'd held Harry like something that might break, and Lily had laughed and said, "He's sturdier than he looks. Sirius, he's not a teacup," and stood. Harry grabbed his collar. "Right," Sirius said. "Let's go see your new house." Thaddeus Clearwater was 43 years old, had been the House of Black's primary solicitor for 11 years, and had never in his professional life been asked to complete a property purchase in 48 hours. He did it anyway, because the Black family retainer was substantial, and because there was something in Sirius Black's voice on the telephone, a quality of absolute, quiet urgency that had nothing to do with panic, and everything to do with someone who has identified what needs to happen and is not interested in discussing whether it is convenient. That made arguing about timelines feel beside the point. Number 6. Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Previous owners relocated on short notice. Building in sound structural condition. Garden requiring attention. The deed transferred to a holding trust of the House of Black, legal possession granted same day. The moving truck arrived on a cold gray morning not long after. Muggle Company, Muggle Agency, Muggle Cash. The neighbors came to their windows with the instinct that communities have when something new arrives in their midst and needs to be assessed. The man who climbed out of the cab was too young for the seriousness of his face and too certain of himself for a man in a leather jacket, directing hired movers through the gate of a Surrey semi-detached. He had the kind of physical presence that made people on the pavement find reasons to cross to the other side. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the instinct that some people take up more space than others without meaning to, and that being in that space uninvited feels like an imposition. He looked at number 4 once, Just once. A flat, measuring look. The kind that takes inventory without announcing that it's doing so. Noting the garden ornaments, the hanging basket, the curtains, the specific quality of a house that has decided what it is, and committed to communicating this decision to the neighbors at all times. Then he turned away, and directed the movers to be careful with the third crate, the one with the books. Petunia Dursley, behind her lace curtain, had gone the color of old putty somewhere around the second crate. Vernon Dursley came home from work that evening to find a car he didn't recognize in the adjacent drive and 2 stone dogs flanking the gate of number 6. They had not been there that morning. They were the height of a large Labrador and carved from something dark that wasn't quite granite, and they had, undeniably, the quality of watching. Not in any way that Vernon could have explained to a reasonable person, but watching nonetheless, with the patient attention of things that have been told to pay attention and intend to do so indefinitely. Vernon stood in his own drive for a full 30 seconds trying to determine whether they had been there before, and he simply hadn't noticed. He went inside, without reaching a conclusion. Inside number 6, Sirius Black sat on the floor of the living room with Harry on his lap and an illustrated book about animagi open on the floor in front of them. The furniture wouldn't arrive until the following day, and he'd never much cared about furniture anyway. The book was from the Black family library, originally intended for reading-age children. Harry was not yet reading age. He was, however, extremely interested in the pictures, which showed the stages of transformation with the specific detail of texts designed for young wizards who would one day need to understand what they were looking at. The largest picture showed a great shaggy dog mid-transformation, the lines of the human figure visible still in the set of its shoulders and the intelligence in its eyes. Harry reached out and touched the page with 2 fingers, pressing the illustration as if testing whether it was real. "That's a very old kind of magic," Sirius said, "one of the oldest. It's about learning to live in more than one shape." He looked at the top of Harry's head, at the lightning bolt mark just visible through the dark hair. "You're going to learn a lot of old magic. All the kinds that matter. I promise you that." Harry said something that wasn't a word yet. A sound with the rising inflection of a question and the confidence of someone who expects to be answered. "I know," Sirius said. "I'm working on it." He did the ward work that night. The first layer went down at 11:30, when the street was empty and the cold had driven even the most determined dog-walkers inside. He moved the perimeter in silence, setting the anchor points at intervals precise to the inch, the way the Black family ward work had always required. No wand flourishes, no incantations said aloud. The gray work was not theatrical. It was structural, the difference between a building that has been decorated to look strong and one that has been engineered to be so. The second layer took an hour, the third the interaction layer, the one designed to interface with Lily's existing sacrifice magic and create the expansion he'd theorized with the Gringotts team. Took until 2 in the morning and cost him a headache that he knew from experience would last 3 days. But when it was done, the street changed. Not visibly. Not to any eye that wasn't specifically trained to see ward work in its passive state. But the quality of the air shifted in a way that Sirius could feel in his back teeth. A deepening, a settling, like a chord finding its resolution after a long suspension. The 2 ward systems, Lily's sacrifice magic and the Black family's gray work, had found each other. We're talking to each other. We're doing something together that neither could have done alone. Something that produced, in the substrate of the street, a warmth that wasn't quite warmth, and a safety that went deeper than protection. He stood in the middle of Privet Drive at 2 in the morning and felt the result of it. Not warm, exactly. Warmth was too simple a word. Something more like recognition. The feeling of a lock understanding that the right key has arrived. He was almost back to number 6 when the back door of number 4 opened. Petunia Dursley came out in her dressing gown to put the recycling out. She walked 3 steps into her garden, and then she stopped. The ward had found her. Not the black wards. Those were not for her. Lily's ward, the original, the sacrifice matrix that had spent weeks anchored to number 4, with no one present who could resonate with it at all. No one who shared Lily's blood, and could therefore hear what the ward was saying. It found Petunia through her blood. The Lily blood, the blood of sisters, the last biological connection to the magic that had given everything to keep one small person safe. Petunia stood in her garden in the cold and felt her sister's hand in hers. She couldn't have said why she thought of it that way. She would not have described it that way to anyone, ever, because she had spent years choosing not to think about Lily in terms that acknowledged what Lily actually was. But that was what it was. The specific pressure of a small hand. The weight of it, lighter than she remembered, younger than she remembered. The hand from before everything became complicated. A summer afternoon. A long time ago, before everything divided into before and after. She stood there for 30 seconds. Then she went back inside and locked the door. She did not mention it to Vernon. She would not mention it to anyone, ever, but she stood at her kitchen window for a long time after, looking at the dark garden, and did not go to bed until very late. And if there was something in her expression while she stood there, something that was not quite grief and not quite comfort, and was, perhaps, the specific feeling of being forgiven for something you have not yet forgiven yourself for, there was no one there to see it. Inside number 6, Harry slept. The ward kept. The story had begun. The fence between number 4 and number 6 was 3 feet of painted wood, and the most important threshold on Privet Drive. Harry understood this before he understood most other things. He understood it the way very young children understand geography, not as a concept but as a body fact, the way you know the difference between warm and cold before you have words for either. One side of the fence was one kind of world. The other side was a different kind entirely. One side had a kitchen that smelled of cleaning products and an absence of conversation that had its own specific texture, like a held breath that never gets released. The other side had books and the smell of old wood and ward residue, and a man who sat on the floor when he talked to you, because sitting on the floor was the correct height for talking to someone your size. He was climbing it by the time he was 2. Not with any particular agility at first, more with the specific determination of a person who has identified where he needs to be and is prepared to negotiate any obstacle between himself and that location. He would grip the top rail with both hands, walk his feet up the painted wood, and topple over the other side into the garden of number 6, with a conviction that the landing would sort itself out. It usually did. The garden had opinions about Harry's safety that expressed themselves in small, practical ways. A soft patch of grass where there had been hard earth a moment before, a bush that shifted 3 inches to the left in the half-second before it would otherwise have been in the way. The ward work, layered deep in the property's soil, had been doing this since Sirius first put it down. He noticed it early, made a note, and then decided not to interfere with it, because the alternative was telling a 2-year-old not to climb the fence, which was not a conversation that would produce results. Harry was very clear about where he needed to be. The ward was apparently in agreement. The Dursleys fed Harry. They clothed him. They did not speak to him very much, which suited everyone. Petunia had developed a system of managed distance. She looked after his physical requirements with the thoroughness of a woman who understood obligation and the emotional investment of one who was trying, very hard, not to have any. Vernon ignored him in a way that required active effort, the specific effort of someone constructing a blind spot and maintaining it daily. Dudley, older and already developing the particular confidence of a child who has been told he is the center of the universe, had no system at all. He simply didn't notice Harry was there most of the time, which was, on balance, the most honest response of the 3. The kitchen window of number 6 was always lit. Harry knew this the way he knew his own hands. Whatever time he woke, whatever the season, whatever the particular quality of the morning, the light in the kitchen at number 6 was on, and the man who smelled like old books and motor oil and something that Harry would later learn to identify as ward residue was usually visible through it, reading or writing or simply standing at the counter with a cup of tea. Present in the way that certain people are present, which is to say that you were aware of them even when you weren't looking. It was the specific presence of someone who has decided to be somewhere and means it. The education began, as most real educations do, without announcing itself as one. Harry sat in the kitchen of number 6 and absorbed, by proximity, the texture of a household that worked. He learned that problems had methods. He learned that silence was not absence. He learned from watching Sirius at his Thursday chess games against himself, a habit Sirius had acquired and never surrendered, that the most important moves were the ones that didn't look like moves, that the game happening on the surface of the board was never the only game being played. "Why do you play both sides?" Harry asked, at 3.5, which was the age at which he had developed the habit of asking questions that didn't have obvious answers. He had also developed the habit of waiting for actual answers rather than the simplified versions adults tended to offer children. And Sirius had figured this out early enough that he had stopped offering them. "Because the only way to understand the board completely," Sirius said, moving a knight, "is to know what both players want." Harry thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "What does that one want?" He pointed to the White Queen. "To protect her king by being more dangerous than anything that might threaten him." "And the Black Queen?" "The same. That's the thing about queens," he said, setting the piece down with the care of someone who respects what he's handling. "They're always the most dangerous piece on the board, whatever color they are. The game just dresses them differently." Harry nodded with the seriousness of someone filing this information in a place where it would be retrievable, cross-referenced, available when it became relevant. Which it would. He was already certain of that. The first controlled wandless spell happened on a Thursday afternoon in autumn, 14 months after Harry's 3rd birthday. The puzzle box was black family make, a muggle-looking wooden cube that opened only in response to magical intent directed at the specific locking mechanism, a training tool used on black children for generations. Sirius had given it to Harry with no instruction beyond "see what you think," which was his standard approach to giving Harry something new. Present the problem, step back, observe what happened when someone who hadn't been told how to fail at something encountered it without preconceptions. Harry sat with it for 2 weeks. He turned it over. He pressed things. He thought at it in the way that Sirius had been quietly, consistently demonstrating was the correct precursor to any magical action. That specific interior stillness, the gathering of attention into a single point, the difference between wanting something and intending it. On the Thursday, he was not being patient. He was frustrated. The box had been uncooperative for 14 days, and he was done with its being uncooperative, and he wanted it open. And the wanting was large and immediate, and entirely without the stillness that was supposed to precede it. The lid swung back. Harry stared at it. Then he looked at the doorway, where Sirius was standing, because Sirius was always approximately where you needed him to be. "Again," Sirius said. Harry closed the box. He held it in both hands. He found the place inside himself where the frustration had come from, that urgent, ungoverned wanting, and discovered that underneath it was something cleaner and more useful. Not emotion at all, but direction. Pure and specific, stripped of everything that wasn't relevant. He pointed that direction at the lock. The lid swung back again. Smoothly, without the jerky urgency of the first time. The motion of a mechanism that has been asked correctly rather than forced. "The first one was feeling," Sirius said, coming into the room and sitting on the floor across from Harry, because sitting on the floor was still the correct height. "The second one was intent. You understand the difference? Feeling is what it does to you." Harry said, working it out as he said it, finding the shape of it in words as he went. Intent is what you do with it. Sirius looked at him for a moment with an expression Harry was still too young to read correctly. Though he would understand it later, the expression of a man who is watching someone else's child do something that would have made their father laugh, and who is trying to hold both the pride and the grief of that simultaneously, and who is mostly succeeding. Yes, Sirius said. Exactly that. The dueling dummies arrived in spring of Harry's 4th year, constructed in the back garden of number 6 over a single weekend, and installed along the garden's back wall with the specificity of someone who had thought very carefully about angles and sightlines. They were padded, articulated, and enchanted to move in response to magical input directed at them. But that was not, Sirius explained, the point of them. Perception before technique, Sirius said. Technique without perception is just noise. Harry stood in the back garden in the weak spring sunlight and practiced noticing things. The dummies moved when he wasn't looking at them directly. He learned to catch movement in peripheral vision, the slight blur at the edge of awareness that meant something had changed. He learned to feel the slight displacement in the ward air when something in the garden changed position, the way a room's sound changes subtly when a door opens even before you consciously register the sound. He learned that attention was not the same as looking, and that the most useful kind of awareness was the kind you maintained without effort, broad and patient and waiting. The neighbors, on the occasions they looked over the fence, saw what appeared to be an exercise class of 2, one large and one very small, doing something that made no obvious sense. One of them mentioned it at a neighborhood watch meeting. The consensus was that it was probably some kind of martial arts. Everyone agreed the stone dogs at the gate were unsettling and left it at that. Vernon Dursley had not spoken directly to his neighbor in 3.5 years and had constructed this achievement with considerable effort. He crossed the street when the man from number 6 was in his front garden. He arranged his newspaper at breakfast to block the kitchen window's sightline. He had developed an internal monologue about hypnotists and about the particular kind of person who wore leather jackets in Surrey and kept stone dogs that watched things. A monologue that was sufficient, on most days, to manage his awareness of the situation. In the spring of Harry's 3rd year on Privet Drive, the arrangement collapsed. The disagreement between Dudley and Harry had begun in the garden and escalated through the fence into the street. Dudley was 4 inches taller than Harry, and had the advantage of absolute certainty that the adults in his life would support his position regardless of its merits. He used this advantage freely, as people do when they have never had reason to doubt it. Vernon came out of number 4 with the specific energy of a man who has been waiting for an excuse to do exactly this. He got 3 sentences out. Now look here. 1, you'll keep that boy of yours. 2, and I won't have the beginning of 3, which did not become a complete sentence, because Sirius Black stepped out of his front door and crossed the distance between number 6's gate and the street with the unhurried movement of a man who is entirely certain that the situation will arrange itself around him when he arrives, and does not need to hurry to make that happen. "Mr. Dursley," he said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of something that had been calibrated very precisely to carry exactly as far as required and no further. That is the last time you raise your voice within range of this child, or any child. Do you understand me? It was not a question. It had the form of a question, and the nature of a structural fact, and the vox imperium behind it, deployed at perhaps 1/5 of its full capacity. The equivalent of a hand placed firmly and without violence against a chest, made Vernon's voice simply stop working. He tried for 5 seconds to produce sound. His mouth moved with the conviction of someone who has been talking his way through life and has never previously encountered a situation in which the talking apparatus simply ceased to cooperate. His face progressed through several colors. Nothing came out. Sirius waited, entirely at ease. He had the patience of someone who has spent 10 years doing difficult things correctly and has developed. as a byproduct, a very high tolerance for other people's discomfort. When Vernon nodded, a small, unwilling movement, the nod of a man who has lost an argument he didn't know he was having, the grip released. Vernon walked back into number 4 without looking at anyone, with the stiff dignity of someone trying to appear as though what had just happened was a voluntary decision. The door closed. Harry, who had watched all of this from the pavement, was dusting himself off with the focused dignity of someone who has decided that the best response to humiliation is to immediately appear as though it didn't happen and hasn't happened, and in fact, the whole preceding 5 minutes were entirely unremarkable. Sirius looked down at him and crouched to Harry's level, which was something he always did and which Harry had always registered as important without having the vocabulary for why. "Are you hurt?" "No, good. The size of someone's voice is not a measurement of the size of their authority. You understand the difference?" Harry thought about the chess queens, the most dangerous piece on the board, whatever color they were, the game just dressing them differently. "Yes," he said. That evening, Vernon told Petunia over dinner that the man next door was some kind of hypnotist. He said it with the specific conviction of a man who has found an explanation that fits and has decided not to examine it too closely. Petunia said nothing. She had her own theories, none of which she intended to share with Vernon, and all of which were considerably more accurate. The document arrived on a Tuesday. Sirius had arranged it through Clearwater, who had arranged it through a notary, who had produced something that looked entirely Muggle, cream paper, formal language, an official-looking seal, and was not Muggle at all. Vernon signed it at the dining table of number 6 in a state of careful compliance, his hand very steady in the way that hands are steady when the alternative has been clearly communicated without anything so crude as a threat. Petunia signed after him, with the precise, controlled signature of a woman who has decided that the circumstances require her to do this, and is doing it without permitting herself to think too carefully about what it means that the circumstances require it. The document said, in language that left no room for later reinterpretation, that neither Vernon nor Petunia Dursley would discipline, restrict, demean, or physically restrain Harry James Potter by any means, at any time, for any reason. It sat in Vernon's filing cabinet next to his car insurance. He never voluntarily touched it again. But he knew, with the specific awareness of a man who has encountered something he cannot explain and cannot dismiss, that it was there. It had a weight in his awareness that was disproportionate to its physical presence. 2 pages of cream paper in a filing cabinet, pressing down on everything else in the way that certain facts press down on the mind that contains them. The garden between the 2 houses was quiet that evening. The stone dogs at the gate of number 6 watched the street with their usual patient attention. Inside, Harry sat on the kitchen floor with the puzzle box and a new problem Sirius had given him. A sequence of 3 interlocking locks that required maintaining 2 distinct intentions simultaneously, without letting either one bleed into the other. He was working on it. The light in the kitchen window of number 6 burned on into the dark. The Ministry's magical flare reports were not public documents. They were filed by the improper use of Magic Office in triplicate, cross-referenced against the Hogwarts admissions registry, and stored in a restricted archive that required a Level 4 clearance to access. Sirius had Level 4 clearance by virtue of his restored status as head of an ancient house, which entitled him to request specific categories of ministry records pertaining to matters of noble house interest. He had filed the request, and the reports arrived packaged in a ministry envelope that smelled of dust and bureaucratic reluctance, and he spread them across his study desk on a Wednesday evening with a cup of tea he fully intended to drink and forgot about entirely within 4 minutes. The reports were, in their way, extraordinary reading. Most Muggle-born magical children produced their first documented accidental magic event between the ages of 2 and 4. Most produced 3 to 5 incidents per year through early childhood, incidents characterized by the standard profile, emotional intensity producing localized and temporary magical effects, Objects moved or broken or inexplicably repaired, small climactic disturbances, the occasional incident involving an animal. The reports were written in the flat administrative language of people who processed the remarkable until it stopped being remarkable, and they documented, year by year, the magical signatures of children who had no framework for what they were. The report for Hermione Jean Granger, residing in North London, began at 14 months. Sirius read it twice, then a third time, more slowly. Her first documented incident involved a mobile above her cot rearranging itself into alphabetical order by the name of the animal depicted. She had been 14 months old. The reporting obliviator had noted in the margin, classification uncertain, possibly coincidental arrangement, which Sirius found genuinely funny in a way that took him a moment to locate. Because the idea of a 14-month-old coincidentally alphabetizing her own mobile was the kind of thing that only made sense if you had never met a 14-month-old. By age 4, 17 separate incidents. By age 6, the point of the report, she was averaging 4 documented magical events per week, and the complexity of the events had long since outpaced what the reporting framework was designed to accommodate. One incident involved spontaneously alphabetizing an entire bookshelf from across a room while she was in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, as though the disordered books were generating a low-level background irritation that her magic had eventually resolved without consulting her. Another involved correcting a sentence in a library book. The library book now read correctly, in permanent ink, and the librarian had filed a complaint with the building's management about unauthorized alterations that remained unresolved. The most recent incident involved a girl in her class who had been saying something unkind. The girl had found, for the remainder of the school day, that every word she attempted to say came out in the wrong order, not scrambled, reversed, perfectly, precisely reversed, so that each sentence arrived intact but backwards, legible only if you were prepared to read it from the end. Sirius set the report down. He thought about this child who had produced controlled, targeted, conceptually sophisticated magic at age 6, with no training, no framework, and no wand. He thought about the specific quality of the reversal hex, not a blunt suppression of speech, but an elegant inversion of it, punishing the content of what was being said by making it temporarily inaccessible while leaving the mechanism entirely undamaged. He thought about what that level of instinctive precision would look like by 11, by 14, by the time she was an adult who understood what she was working with and could apply intention to what was currently operating on pure, uncultivated instinct. Then he wrote to the Grangers. He met them in a coffee shop in Hampstead that he had chosen because it was quiet, and because he had always liked Hampstead, having spent time there as a young man when he needed the particular comfort of a city that minded its own business, and didn't ask what you were doing there, or where you'd come from, or why you looked like you'd been awake for 3 days. He dressed Muggle. He was better at this than most wizards, who tended to approach Muggle clothing with the specific uncertainty of people working from a description rather than experience, producing results that were individually correct and collectively wrong. Sirius had worn jeans and leather jackets since he was 16. He ordered a flat white and arrived 7 minutes early, because arriving early was one of the things Sirius Black did when a meeting mattered, because being early was a form of respect that didn't require saying so and therefore cost nothing and communicated everything. Richard and Helen Granger arrived at precisely the agreed time, which told him something useful about them before they sat down. He told them everything, in order, without softening and without condescension, because both of those things were forms of dishonesty, and he had a professional allergy to dishonesty that had only deepened with age. The wizarding world existed. Their daughter was a witch. Here was what that meant in practical terms. Here was what Hogwarts was. Here was what the social landscape she would enter at 11 looked like, honestly described, without the promotional framing that the Ministry's Muggle liaison materials preferred. The framing that emphasized the wonder and the opportunity and carefully omitted the structural inequities, the blood status politics, the specific ways in which a child from a non-magical family would be positioned, by default as lesser than children whose grandparents had attended the same school. Helen Granger had a small spiral notepad. She made notes throughout, in a handwriting that was compact and extremely legible and clearly the product of someone who had learned early that the best way to keep up with a lecture was to develop a shorthand, and had developed one. By the time Sirius reached the section on the vinculum nominis, she had filled 4 pages. Richard Granger asked 2 questions. The first was, what are the actual risks to her, specifically if she enters this world without the legal protection you're describing? The second was, what do you want from this arrangement? Sirius answered both with the same precision he brought to everything that mattered. The risks, specifically described, with examples. The ways in which a Muggle-born witch without institutional protection was structurally vulnerable in ways that a witch with it was not dramatically, not in any way that would manifest as immediate obvious harm, but in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small diminishments, 1,000 closed doors, 1,000 moments in which her ability would be assessed through the lens of her origins and found wanting before she had produced a single piece of evidence. And what he wanted? Nothing. He was not building an alliance. He was not recruiting. He had identified a child with extraordinary ability who would walk into a world that was structurally designed to diminish her for reasons that had nothing to do with her ability, and he was offering a mechanism to make that harder. That was all. Richard and Helen looked at each other in the way of 2 people who have been making significant decisions together long enough that the conversation can happen without words. A quick exchange of glances that covered more ground than most people managed in a paragraph. They took their 2 weeks. They came back in 1. We have one condition, Helen said, her notepad open to a fresh page. Hermione chooses. Not us. Sirius had been prepared for several responses. He had not been prepared for this one, and the surprise of it, the genuine quality of it, the specific confidence it implied about their daughter's capacity to make a decision of this kind, took him a moment to accommodate. Of course, he said. A Saturday in spring. Harry was 6 years old, and sitting on the garden wall of number 6 in his good clothes. The clothes that weren't for training or for getting dirty, which Harry understood to mean that something worth being taken seriously was about to happen. He had been told there would be visitors. He had been told one of them was a girl his age who was magical, and who Sirius thought he should meet. He had processed this information and then read 2 chapters of a book on animagus theory while he waited, because waiting without something to do seemed like a waste of the time. The gate opened. The girl who came through it had brown hair that had staged a comprehensive revolt against whatever her mother had done to it that morning, and was now expressing itself in several directions simultaneously, with the specific energy of something that has been temporarily suppressed and is making up for lost time. She was wearing a cardigan that was slightly too large, the kind that had probably belonged to someone older and been kept because it was comfortable, and comfortable mattered more than fitting, and she was carrying a copy of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, with the specific grip of someone who has been asked to leave the house without a book, and has simply ignored the request and brought one anyway, on the grounds that the request was unreasonable. She looked at Harry. Harry looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, doing the mutual assessment that children do when they are deciding whether another person is worth the investment of conversation, whether the evidence suggests a mind operating at a frequency that matches their own, or whether this is going to be another interaction in which they spend the whole time slightly ahead of everyone else and slightly lonely about it. Then Hermione held up the book. "Do you know what a nundu is?" "Yes," Harry said. "Don't start with the easy ones." Something in her expression shifted, the particular shift that happened to people who had spent a long time in rooms where they were the only person interested in the things they were interested in, when they encountered evidence that they might not be alone in this. It was not quite relief and not quite excitement, and was probably both. "What's the most dangerous animagus form?" she said. "Probably a nundu, if we're using the Fantastic Beasts taxonomy. But the reason no one attempts it isn't the danger of the form itself. It's that the transformation requires the caster to fully inhabit an animal consciousness that has no framework for human-type intention, so the return transformation becomes theoretically impossible after a certain duration. The caster doesn't lose themselves dramatically, they just gradually stop being able to locate the way back." Hermione stared at him. It was a particular kind of stare, not the stare of someone who doesn't understand what they've heard, but the stare of someone who has understood it completely and is recalibrating their expectations of the conversation accordingly. "I read that in a restricted text," Harry added, with the faint note of apology of someone who is aware they may have gone further than the situation required, but cannot, in good conscience, stop. "Sirius has restricted texts? He has all kinds." She sat down on the wall next to him without being invited, which was the correct thing to do. "I've been trying to find books about magic in Muggle libraries. There's almost nothing. One encyclopedia in a charity shop in Islington that got about 40% of the facts wrong and kept calling wands magical staves. That's agonizing." It really was. It described transfiguration as the mystical art of making one thing pretend to be another, as though the teacup is still a mouse inside and is simply having a very convincing dream. "That's not even wrong in an interesting way," Harry said. "It's wrong in a boring way, which is worse." They were in the middle of a detailed discussion of the taxonomical errors in the charity shop encyclopedia, which were numerous, and which Hermione had apparently catalogued with the thoroughness of someone who had read the thing twice and taken notes, when Sirius and the Grangers came through the gate. Sirius stopped. He stood there for a moment and simply watched, and the expression on his face was one that Helen Granger filed away and kept. The look of a man watching something that was always going to happen finally happening on schedule, arriving exactly where and when it was supposed to arrive. Later that afternoon, in the study of number 6, Sirius sat across from Hermione in the 2 chairs by the window that he used when he was having a conversation he wanted to give its proper weight. The Grangers were in the sitting room. Harry was in the garden showing Richard Granger his training schedule with the focused pride of someone who has prepared something and wants it properly appreciated. Sirius explained the vinculum nominis without abbreviation. What it was, what it would do to her legal standing, the specific protections it conferred, the way it changed her positioning within wizarding law from unaffiliated Muggle born to member of a noble house, and what that meant in practical terms for every subsequent interaction she would have with institutions that had been designed, intentionally or otherwise, with people like her at the margins rather than the center. What it would not do, he was careful about this, because the limits of a protection were as important as its scope, and he had a particular dislike for people who oversold armor and then seemed surprised when their beneficiaries discovered it had gaps. Hermione listened the way she did everything, completely, without interruption, processing information in real time and storing it in the specific way that suggested she would be able to reproduce it accurately 3 weeks later, cross-referenced against everything else she knew, with footnotes. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "It won't change who I am," she said. It was not quite a question. It was the statement of someone checking their understanding and wanting it confirmed. "It will change how the law sees you," Sirius said, "not who you are. Those are different things. No one can change who you are. That's rather the point of doing this, making sure no one gets the chance to try." She considered this with the seriousness of someone who had been taking her own mind seriously for long enough that she had developed a methodology for it. A process by which new information was assessed, integrated, and either accepted or challenged, and which had no room for either easy agreement or reflexive resistance. "I want to understand all the documents before anyone signs anything," she said. "Obviously, and I want my own copy of everything. I would be concerned if you didn't." She nodded once, with the finality of a decision that had been properly made, not quickly, not impulsively, but arrived at through the correct process, and therefore solid. The ceremony took place in the back garden of number 6 at dusk, a few weeks later. The ward work made the garden quiet in the particular way of enclosed spaces that have been deliberately protected. Not silence exactly, but the quality of sound that belongs to a place that has decided what it will and will not permit inside its perimeter. That has drawn a line around itself and means it. The light was the specific gold of late afternoon resolving into evening, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look more significant than it might otherwise, though in this case the significance was not the light's doing. Sirius wore the formal black family robes. They were midnight fabric, silver at the cuffs, and he wore them with the ease of someone who grew up in them, and the specific discomfort of someone who has spent years preferring jeans. The ease and the discomfort coexisting the way things do when you are simultaneously exactly where you are from and very far from where you started. The Grangers stood to the left. Harry stood to the right with the particular stillness he produced when he understood that something important was happening and had decided to give it his full attention. The words of the vinculum nominees were Latin, old enough that several of the constructions predated classical usage, and Sirius had practiced them until they came out with the precision that the rite required. He spoke them without flourish, because the gray work didn't require flourish. It required accuracy. The difference between the two was the difference between a lock that looks impressive and a lock that actually works. When the rite completed, a pulse of silver light moved across Hermione's hands. Not dramatic, not sustained. The light of a cord resolving after a long suspension, there and then absorbed, and then simply part of the structure. As if it had always been meant to be there and had simply been waiting for someone to do the paperwork. Harry watched all of this with enormous gravity. Then, when the garden was quiet again, and the ward had settled back into its habitual patience, he said, "Does this mean she's my sister?" Sirius looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Harry. Something passed between two 6-year-olds that required no translation and no adult interpretation. The specific recognition of two people who have just understood something about their situation that the adults in the room already knew and had been waiting for them to arrive at. "Yes," Sirius said. "That's exactly what it means." 3 weeks later, a ministry official from the Muggle Liaison Office knocked on the Granger family door in North London. He was polite. He had a clipboard. He wanted to discuss some outstanding paperwork regarding Muggle-born registration and follow-up documentation. He had the particular confidence of a man who deals in bureaucratic authority and has found it sufficient for most situations. The confidence of someone who has learned that most people, when faced with a clipboard and an official tone, simply cooperate. Helen Granger produced a letter. It was on House of Black stationery. The paper was heavy cream stock. The ink was silver and had not faded. The wax seal was pressed so deeply into the paper that it had become part of it. The letter contained 4 sentences. The first 3 established context and legal position, clearly and without ornament. The last one read, "Any further communication regarding Miss Granger Black should be directed to the legal office of the House of Black, care of Gringotts. Thank you for your attention to this matter." The ministry official read it twice. He looked at the seal for a moment longer than he'd looked at the rest of it. The specific, careful look of someone assessing something they recognize without being entirely sure they want to have recognized it. He left. He did not return. He did not send anyone else in his place. Helen Granger framed the letter that afternoon and hung it in her study. Between a photograph of Hermione at age 3 attempting to read a book that was larger than her torso, and the certificate from the dental practice that Richard had finally gotten around to mounting properly. It looked, among these things, precisely where it belonged. The robes had been made by a woman in Diagon Alley named Augustina Voss, who had been making robes for old families since before Sirius was born, and who received his commission with the specific stillness of a craftsperson who has been given a problem worth solving and is already, internally, solving it. Midnight silk. Not the fashionable near black that most families considered sufficient. Actual midnight. the color at the precise point where blue concedes entirely to black. The color that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, so that in candlelight the fabric appeared to generate its own darkness rather than merely existing within it. The silver thread at the cuffs and collar ran in the black family runic border, a pattern that had been in the family's ceremonial wardrobe for centuries and that, to anyone with the training to read passive runic arrays, said one thing with complete clarity: under the protection of the House of Black. Not a boast, not an advertisement, a structural fact, embedded in the fabric, readable by anyone with the relevant skill. Not ostentatious, not designed to impress, simply correct. Harry put them on the morning of September the 1st in the bedroom of number 6 that had been his for 10 years, and looked at himself in the mirror with the expression of someone doing a final check before a significant engagement. The robes fit because Augustina Voss did not make robes that didn't fit. His holly wand was in his left pocket, 11 inches, reasonably supple, acquired in Ollivanders with the specific quiet that had settled over the shop when the wand chose him. Ollivander's expression, the particular expression of a man whose work continues to surprise him after decades, which was either reassuring or alarming depending on your disposition. His trunk was packed with the methodical completeness of someone who had been preparing for this specific day since approximately the age of 7. He went downstairs. Sirius was at the kitchen table in muggle clothes, jeans, leather jacket. The particular combination that Harry had understood since childhood meant his godfather was operating in both worlds simultaneously, and had chosen the one that required less explanation to people who might see him getting on a train. He was reading a letter and drinking coffee, and looked up when Harry came in with the expression he reserved for things he was proud of, and was not going to say so directly, because saying so directly was not how Sirius Black communicated pride. He communicated it sideways, the way the important things were usually communicated. "Ready?" Sirius said. "Yes. Eat something first." "I've eaten." "Eat more." Harry ate more. This was not the first time this conversation had happened, and would not be the last. King's Cross at 10:30 on a September morning was doing what King's Cross did, moving large numbers of people with focused efficiency and the ambient noise of a building that had decided to commit fully to its purpose. Sirius moved through it in the way he moved through all Muggle spaces, with the comfortable authority of someone who had never found the non-magical world threatening or foreign. He guided them through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, with the relaxed manner of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. On the other side, he became someone slightly different, not dramatically, not with any visible change. But he straightened in a way that was almost imperceptible, and the quality of his attention shifted, and the people on the platform, witches and wizards in various states of emotional investment in the morning's departure, registered his presence the way people register a shift in the weather. Several of them recognized him. The exonerated Black, the man who caught Pettigrew, the man who had been quietly and methodically rebuilding a political position for 10 years from the specific starting point of a person who had lost everything and decided to reconstruct it with better architecture than the original had possessed. Heads turned. Harry, for his part, was in the middle of a question about the ward interaction properties of the Hogwarts perimeter that he wanted Sirius to clarify before he went inside the school and could observe them directly. Hermione was walking on his other side with her list, 9 items long, organized by subject, cross-referenced against the syllabus she had obtained from Professor McGonagall by writing a letter in August that was extremely polite, very specific, and clearly the work of someone who considered the standard information package inadequate and had decided to do something about it. They were, in other words, 11 years old. Sirius sent them off with 3 things. "Pay attention," he said. "Don't let the institution think for you. Your job is not to be the most impressive people in the room. Your job is to be the most useful." "Those often coincide," Hermione said. Sirius looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has said something they believe and has just encountered confirmation from an unexpected direction. Yes, that's rather the point. Harry looked at Sirius for a moment that lasted a beat longer than the ordinary. The specific beat of two people who have operated as a unit for a long time, and know how to say the things that don't have words. The things that exist in the space between what is said and what is understood. Then he picked up his trunk and followed Hermione onto the train. The compartment they chose was in the middle of the train. Harry opened a book. Hermione made a notation on her list. Ron Weasley appeared at the door with red hair and freckles and the open face of someone who is looking for something and is fairly confident they'll find it if they just keep looking. "Everywhere else is full," he said. "Mind if I sit?" Harry indicated the seat. Ron settled, arranged his trunk, and then did what people did when they were in a small enclosed space with Harry and didn't know what to do about it yet. "You're Harry Potter." "Yes, right, sorry, yeah," he collected himself. "Ron Weasley." "I know," Harry said, and then, reading Ron's expression accurately, not because of anything sinister, "Sirius briefed me on most of the families I was likely to meet. He said your father is one of the most genuinely principled people in the ministry, and that the Weasley family's reputation for loyalty is the most consistent thing in Wizarding Britain." Ron processed this. "He said that? Sirius Black said that about my dad? He also said your brother Fred has a gift for applied magical theory that he's currently wasting on joke products. But that joke products are actually quite technically demanding, so perhaps it's not as wasted as it appears." Ron stared at him. Then, slowly, he began to grin. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds about right." When Draco Malfoy appeared at the compartment door 20 minutes later with Crabbe and Goyle arranged behind him, he delivered his speech about the right sort, with the practiced confidence of a boy who has said it enough times that he believes the words are his own. Harry listened to all of it. "I know your father," he said pleasantly, without heat. "He and Sirius are on the Board of Governors together." Draco had been briefed on Sirius Black in the specific careful register of a man describing something he would prefer to be further away from than he currently was. He did not have a prepared response for this. He left. The Great Hall appeared to first-year students, as it always did. An argument for magic made entirely from light and scale and the specific impossibility of a ceiling that showed you the sky without being open to it. Harry walked in with the other first years, and the midnight silk caught the candlelight in the way that quality material does, not glittering, not calling attention to itself, simply being the thing it was in the light that was available. When McGonagall called his name, Harry walked to the stool with the even pace of someone who has been walking towards significant things for long enough that the walk itself no longer requires management. The hat descended. "Interesting. Exceptionally interesting. You've been trained. Yes, not just taught. Trained. There's a difference. And you know it." A pause. The quality of something reading very carefully. "You have the courage they'd want in Gryffindor. The mind they'd prize in Ravenclaw. The drive that Slytherin would recognize and use." "What do you want from this school, Harry Potter?" "To understand everything that was kept from me," he said. "And to be ready for what I understand when I find it." The hat was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that the hall below began to pay attention to it. "You know what the board looks like from above. You've been taught that. There is only one house that will let you use it." Slytherin, the Great Hall held its silence for 3 full seconds. Then the Slytherin table began to applaud, carefully, with the instinct of a house that recognized when something significant had just been assigned to its care. Harry took his seat and looked across the hall as Hermione's name was called. The hat touched her head. 2 seconds. Gryffindor, Hermione walked to her seat with her chin up and her list still in her left hand. Across the hall, her eyes found Harry's. The following morning, the Daily Prophet noted that the House of Black had placed students in 2 different houses simultaneously for the first time in living memory. Lucius Malfoy read this at breakfast, refilled his tea with entirely steady hands, looked at the middle distance for a moment his wife chose not to interrupt, then turned the page. The steadiness was the most revealing thing about the morning. Marcus Flint occupied the best chair in the Slytherin common room. 5th year, broad, the physical confidence of someone who had spent 4 years establishing that his size entitled him to priority in enclosed spaces. Harry walked in and took the second best chair. Better upholstery, better sightline. He opened his book, Ward Theory, 7th year level. Flint's approach took 11 minutes. First years, Flint said, 2 5th years flanking him, sit over there. Harry looked up, taking long enough that the pause became a choice. I'll keep this seat, thank you, Harry said. The upholstery is better. Do you know who I am? Yes, Harry said, setting the book on his knee. Marcus Flint, 5th year, kept back once. Your father is in Cauldron Imports, Eastern European suppliers. The business has had difficulties since the Malfoy family began pricing aggressively in the same market. I'm genuinely sorry about that. It's a hard market to compete in when the competitor has the Malfoy distribution network. Is there something you actually need? Or are we done? The common room went very quiet. Flint tried 3 more approaches. None of them worked. It was Gemma Farley, 7th year prefect, who finally set down her advanced charms text and asked Harry very calmly who his godfather was. Sirius Black, Harry said. She told Flint, in the same even tone, to leave the first years alone for the remainder of term. Flint opened his mouth. She looked at him. He closed it. Later, Gemma pulled a chair alongside Harry's. You're going to be interesting to watch, she said. I hope not, Harry said. Interesting to watch implies visible. I'd rather be useful. Slytherin hasn't had anyone think in those terms in quite a while. It's not a fixed condition, Harry said. No. She looked at him directly. Professor Snape is the most intelligent person in this castle. He's also been fighting a war with Gryffindor since 1981 that exists entirely in his own head. It costs the house. I know about that too. Get some sleep, Potter Black. You've made enough of an impression for one evening. Snape delivered his opening potions address with the precision of someone who had refined it over 11 years of first classes. Then he turned to the questions. Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? The draught of living death, Harry said. Asphodel belongs to the lily family, which is relevant to its magical properties. It's associated with mourning in classical mythology, which isn't incidental to how the potion functions. The name references death, but the effect is suspension. The distinction matters for antidote preparation. Snape asked the third question. Harry answered it the same way, accurately, completely, with additional information that indicated not just knowledge of the answer, but understanding of the territory around it. No performance. This was simply the way the boy thought. After the third answer, Snape stopped and performed, in 3 seconds of silence. A rapid and uncomfortable revision of several positions he had held for 10 years. He asked Harry to stay after class. The pretext was a minor error in his third ingredient. The error was not real. Your godfather trained you, Snape said. Yes, in what? Harry listed them: occlumency, ward theory, dueling theory, potions, Latin, animagus theory, Visengamot procedure. He says adequate in occlumency is better than exceptional in most other skills, Harry said, because it's the one thing that keeps everything else private. That is a surprisingly sensible observation. He has those occasionally. Your father, Snape said, did not. I know you hated my father, Harry said, with the even delivery of someone who has considered a thing and decided to be honest about it. I know some of what happened between you. I'm not asking you to forgive it or forget it. I'm asking if we can proceed on the assumption that I'm not him. Snape was quiet for a long time. That remains to be demonstrated. Of course, Harry said. That's how it should work. The ceasefire happened at number 6, over tea, on an October weekend. Sirius and Snape in the kitchen with the specific quality of honesty that settles into spaces when the people in them have run out of reasons to perform. Sirius told him about Peter, Flatly, Snape's expression did something very small and very controlled. They discussed Harry, what he needed. The gap between what Hogwarts was designed to teach and what Sirius had already ensured he knew. "You're the best potions teacher they're going to have," Sirius said. "And you spend half your energy maintaining a rivalry with Gryffindor that has been over since 1981. On whose terms? Yours. Entirely yours." "He has her eyes," Snape said finally. "Yes, they're not a performance. No, he never performs." "You're doing better than I expected," Snape said. "It cost him something." "That's the kindest thing you've ever said to me." "Don't push it, Black! Ceasefire!" The pause lasted 4 seconds. "Ceasefire," Snape said quietly. Harry identified the concealment on the 3rd floor on his 2nd day of term. The ward air thickening in a way that indicated something being kept rather than something being blocked. Recent work, multiple casters. He sent Sirius a letter. "Find out what it is. Don't touch it. Tell me when you know." Quirrell carried the secret badly. His stammer appeared in structured situations and vanished in unstructured ones, the inverse of genuine anxiety. The turban never left, and he maintained a specific physical awareness of it at all times, never allowing a complete view of the back of his skull. "He's concealing something on his person," Harry wrote to Sirius. "Not metaphorically. Physically, the turban is structural." Sirius's next letter arrived in 1 day rather than 2. Hermione found Nicholas Flamel in the 2nd week of November and set the open book in front of Harry at breakfast without preamble. The Philosopher's Stone, the only known maker in recorded history. A Gringotts vault robbery in July, a vault emptied earlier the same day. "The vault was emptied before the robbery," Harry said. "Yes, Dumbledore moved it here before anyone knew to look for it." "Yes, and Quirrell is trying to get it," Harry wrote to Sirius that evening. 4 paragraphs. "Here is what is being kept in the school. Here is who is trying to steal it. Here is why the existing security is inadequate. Here is what should happen instead." Clearwater arrived at Grimmauld Place and read the letter once. "The Board of Governors has standing to raise a school safety matter," he said. "I have the votes. I need it filed by Monday." In Dumbledore's office, Fawkes regarded Sirius from his perch. The silver instruments continued their small, precise movements. "My godson is 11 years old, Professor," Sirius said. If he identified the concealment mechanism, the operative threat, and the security's specific inadequacy from outside a corridor in 3 weeks, the security is not adequate. You are relying on puzzles and creatures to stop a man who has Voldemort on the back of his head. "Yes," Dumbledore said, very quietly. "On the question of whether the stone should be in a school at all, we agree." The stone was transferred to Gringotts. Quirrell made his attempt 2 nights later, moved through every obstacle, arrived at the mirror room, stood in front of it, and could not take what it would not give him. 2 DMLE officers stepped out from behind the mirror. Having been stationed there on a warrant Amelia Bones had signed within the hour of receiving it. The shade of Tom Riddle managed 1 sentence toward Harry Potter, standing in the ministry corridor outside with Sirius. "A threat. Not recorded." "I know," Harry said to Sirius beside him. "We'll be ready." Harry found the voice in the walls in his 3rd week of 2nd year, very old, very slow. The cadences of something that had been speaking the same dialect since before the castle's current architecture existed. He practiced Parseltongue internally for 2 months before he told Hermione. "How long?" she said. 2 months. I need you to never do that again." Agreed. She found the chamber's entrance in December, a sink in the 2nd-floor girls' bathroom with a snake carved into the tap. So worn by time it was almost unreadable. Harry spoke to it in Parseltongue. The sink moved. "We go together," Hermione said. "We go together," Harry agreed. The chamber was cathedral in scale, serpent columns twice the height of a grown man, ceiling lost in darkness, stone slightly darker than the rest of Hogwarts. She was enormous and moved like water moves, her eyes closed. They remained closed. "Ancient One, we come without weapons. We come to speak." Long since anyone spoke the language of my making. Long since anyone came without a sword. I know what the ones who came before wanted from you. I'm not here for that. There is something controlling you. I want to remove it, if you'll let me. You are air, distant, the line is thin. But real, because enslavement is wrong, Harry said. Whatever was done to bind you here was done to you, not by you. That distinction matters. If you fail, I am still a slave. If you succeed, I am free. The risk is yours, not mine. Yes, then try. Ginny Weasley had handed over the diary 4 days earlier with shaking hands and the relief of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has finally been given permission to stop. Harry brought it to the chamber deliberately. She had a right to witness the thing that had been using her undone. The shade of Tom Riddle materialized and delivered his speech about the chamber, the air, the greatest sorcerer in the world. Harry listened to all of it. Then the chamber door opened. Sirius walked the length of the chamber in no particular hurry, formal robes, left hand on the black family cane. He stopped in front of the diary. Sloppy construction, he said to Harry specifically. He was 16. You can see it in the anchoring. I've read your file, Mr. Riddle. You had access to the Black Library through school. You should have done better work. He tapped the diary once with the end of the cane. The diary's pages began to dissolve from the center outward, the sole architecture inside briefly visible as it came apart. The shade screamed. Then, the diary was just an object. From the far end, in the darkness, the basilisk made a sound. She says she's going to sleep now. She should, Sirius said. Something in his expression shifted. Not softness, but the quality of a man who has encountered something very old and has the sense to recognize what that means. She's been working since the 11th century. She's earned a rest. The basilisk's head lowered to the stone floor. Her eyes did not open. Her breathing gradually stilled. Harry sat down on the chamber floor. Not because his legs gave way, because sitting seemed like the correct response to witnessing something that had just chosen, freely and without coercion, the end of a very long captivity. Sirius sat down next to him in formal robes, on a chamber floor. He did it anyway. They sat there for a while. 6 days later, Sirius presented the evidence to the Board of Governors. Lucius Malfoy received it with steady hands that cost him something visible by the 3rd paragraph. You placed a dark artifact in the school bag of an 11-year-old girl, Sirius said. The documentation is filed with the DM Lee. The evidence is in Gringotts' custody. If you'd like to attempt the board angle, I have the votes. If you'd like the legal angle, you have Clearwater's address. If you'd like any other angle, I would encourage you to think very carefully about what you know of the Black family's patience and whether this is the morning to test it. Lucius Malfoy said nothing. He resigned from the board the following Friday. In September of Harry's 3rd year, Sirius filed formal notice that Harry James Potter was assuming the Potter family's hereditary Wizengamot seat as Lord Potter. Clearwater cited 3 precedents and a 1692 statute. The committee issued the seat without further correspondence. For Hermione, Sirius invoked a 1608 statute allowing noble houses to designate a council of learning, an appointed advisory role for individuals whose expertise the house wished to deploy formally in legislative proceedings. Clearwater found it in an archive that hadn't been properly indexed since the 19th century. McGonagall's assessment described a student performing at Newt level in 6 subjects entering her 3rd year. The appointment was approved. Harry's Wizengamot motion removed the Dementors from Hogwarts grounds within 2 weeks, 11 pages, 17 statutes, establishing that the authorization had been issued on a Sunday, when quorum had not been met. Clearwater's 1-page rebuttal contained the specific meeting minutes. The ministry had no counter. Hermione's file on Dolores Umbridge occupied 40 pages. She had been building it since 2nd year. the Muggle-born registration amendment, the werewolf employment restriction, the centaur territory reduction, the being classification downgrade. Not the pattern of a legislator with a philosophy, but the pattern of a legislator with a target. Each piece removing a protection from a group that could not easily challenge the removal. Each filed with impeccable procedural correctness. At the Ethics Committee hearing, Hermione sat at 13 years old, straight, still, hands flat on her knees, notebook visible. She walked the committee through the architecture she had identified, the shape she had recognized at 12 in a library in Scotland. Umbridge interrupted twice. The second time, Hermione simply continued speaking as if the interruption had not occurred. The committee's recommendation, formal censure, mandatory review, ministerial oversight of future proposals from the senior undersecretary's office, was filed the same afternoon. Umbridge was not fired. Not yet. But the architecture of her authority had been made visible, and visible things could be challenged in ways that invisible ones could not. Remus Lupin taught the final term of his defense appointment without the constant low-register awareness that had been with him since September. He taught as if the material mattered because it did, and as if the students were capable of mastering it, because they were. After the final class, Harry waited. "Thank you," Harry said, "for all of it." Lupin looked at him. The look lasted long enough to take something in. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said. His voice was even. "Your father, too." He closed his case. "But mostly I think you'd make yourself proud. That's rarer. And it's better." Sirius read the Triwizard Tournament regulations in August and stopped at page 11. The age restriction applied to students entering themselves. The Goblet of Fire responded to the submission of a house name. Noble houses submitting heirs under medieval protocols had never been formally superseded by the modern restriction. He thought about this for 4 minutes. Then he called Clearwater. "The exception is real," Clearwater said. "I know. It is narrow. I know. And using it will cause significant institutional disruption." Sirius picked up his tea. "Write the submission." They walked through the 47-page brief at the Grimold Place kitchen table. Harry, Sirius, Hermione. She found 2 procedural vulnerabilities. Clearwater addressed them. The goblet accepted the submission. The flame turned green for 3 seconds. The goblet produced 4 names on Halloween. The Great Hall received the 4th name with the specific silence of a room surprised past its ability to immediately respond. Harry had identified Bartemius Crouch Jr. by the 3rd week of October. Crouch Sr.'s behavioral anomalies at the opening feast. Mad-Eye Moody's flickering magical signature, a primary and something beneath it, generating at a different frequency. He told Hermione. They told Sirius. Sirius contacted Amelia Bones. She issued a warrant and placed 2 DM Lee officers at every tournament event. The first task, the Hungarian Horntail. Harry targeted the neck muscles with a binding variant, 30-second suppression of the fire mechanism. He retrieved the egg in 43 seconds. The second task, the lake. Hermione's monitoring charm network provided continuous positional data from the shore. He found 4 hostages. The rules specified retrieving his own. The rules did not specify leaving the others. He brought all 4 up. The third task, the maze. He moved not as a competitor, but as someone conducting a sweep, mapping Crouch Jr.'s interference by magical signature. He arrived at the cup 17 minutes ahead of the next champion, stood in front of it, and did not touch it immediately. Then he picked it up because the DMLA officers were in position, the warrant was active, and Bones had confirmed the surveillance was complete. Sirius was waiting at the arrival point, a ministry coordination room, not a graveyard. Cedric Diggory arrived 4 seconds later, looking somewhat surprised at the number of ministry officials. "Sorry," Harry said to him. "I'll explain." Voldemort rose from the cauldron at midnight, body full-formed, magical core reconstituted. The presence that had been half-existent for over a decade suddenly occupying space with the total conviction of something that has decided to be real again. He stood in the graveyard outside Little Hangleton and looked at Harry Potter standing 15 feet away, and discovered that the boy he had built years of strategy around was not the boy who was standing in front of him. Harry's fear was present. He could locate it exactly. He processed it and moved it to the part of his mind designed to hold it without acting on it. He had been looking at Tom Riddle for 4 years, the pattern of a person who had decided that the only protection against loss was to make loss impossible, and who had pursued that decision with the kind of total commitment that produced extraordinary results and extraordinary damage simultaneously. Sirius stepped out from between 2 yew trees. He had been there since before Harry arrived, having moved through the graveyard's ward perimeter using the blood bond recognition protocol. He was in formal robes and bleeding from a curse at the boundary, assessed it as manageable, and set it aside. "Mr. Riddle," he said. "Black," Voldemort said. The voice was high and cold. "I had wondered. I expect you had. You've had 13 years to wonder about a lot of things. Most of what you wondered about is probably wrong. You cannot stop the restoration. It is complete. I am here. Whatever your plan accounts for, it does not account for this." "The restoration," Sirius said, "is not what we came about. The plan had a name, the foreclosure, which was Hermione's word. The love magic that Lily had placed in the ward matrix had been accumulating in Harry's blood for 15 years, compounding every time the ward renewed. The severance was a cutting spell applied not to objects, but to the connection between Horcrux fragments and their moorings, simultaneous dissolution of all anchor points, using a force sufficiently powerful to reach all of them at once. Lily's accumulated love magic, deployed through Harry as its vessel, was that force. The cost: Harry had to drop his ward deliberately, make himself, for approximately 14 seconds, entirely unshielded. He had agreed to this at the Grimmauld Place kitchen table. He had asked 12 questions, been satisfied by 11 answers, and accepted the 12th's uncertainty as the kind that didn't have a resolution and had to be carried anyway. Voldemort cast the Cruciatus before Harry had finished the thought he was in the middle of. Harry took it in the left shoulder. His occlumency architecture held, not easily, not without cost, but it held. "You killed my parents," he said. His voice came out level. "Not bravery. The outcome of 10 years of training applied in the moment the training was for." "Yes," Voldemort said. "I know what that was supposed to make me. I decided to be something else. The duel was not clean." Voldemort destroyed the foreclosure's initial ward perimeter in under 3 minutes, wounded Sirius significantly with a reducto variant that put him on one knee, forced Harry back toward the graveyard's far boundary. He was winning! Harry felt this clearly and without the emotional response it was supposed to produce. He cast the Patronus, not at Voldemort, but as a signal to activate the second portkey Hermione was holding at the graveyard's edge, where she had been since before midnight. She arrived 4 seconds later. She stood at the graveyard's center, runic array on her palm glowing with activated greywork, and looked at Tom Riddle with the expression of someone who has finished the preparation and is now doing the thing. "Harry," she said. He dropped the ward, all of it, the 15 years of accumulated love magic released outward, in every direction. It left him cold and briefly hollow and entirely present. Hermione cast the severance. The graveyard went absolutely still. 14 seconds. Tom Riddle stood in the center of the stillness, the fractured soul architecture behind his face registering what was happening before his mind did. The anchors cut, simultaneously, cleanly, because Hermione's work was always clean. Tom Riddle stood without his extra lives for the first time in over 50 years. Mortal, genuinely and irreversibly mortal, looking at 2 15-year-olds who looked back at him with neither triumph nor hatred. Sirius, from the ground, identified the expression on their faces. "Pity. You were brilliant," Harry said. The graveyard was quiet enough that the words carried without being raised. You were the most naturally gifted wizard of your generation. You had access to everything. You understood things that most people spend entire careers approaching. And you spent all of it being afraid of death. I'm sorry for what you were. I'm genuinely sorry for that. But it's over. Voldemort raised his wand. The killing curse that left it was his last magical act. The ward remnants, the last dispersing traces of Lily's love magic, caught it at the graveyard's center. Tom Riddle fell in a graveyard in Little Hangleton on a cold night that had no interest in the event, and continued being dark and entirely ordinary around it. Harry sat down in the graveyard grass, not because his legs gave way, because sitting seemed like the correct response to the specific quality of the silence that followed. He reached up and touched his forehead. The scar was still there, but the presence was gone, the cold weight of something that had been there since he was a year old. Simply absent. He was, for the first time in his life, only himself. Sirius reached him first, crossing the graveyard on a damaged left side with the determination of a man who has decided distance is not a relevant objection. He sat down next to Harry in his formal robes. "Are you?" "Yes," Harry said. "Good, I'm going to pass out for a bit." "You are not. I'm rather afraid I am." He didn't, quite. Hermione reached them 30 seconds later and sat on Harry's other side, and said nothing. Which was the correct thing to say. Among those apprehended when the ministry officials arrived, Lucius Malfoy, who looked at Sirius Black, sitting in the grass in formal robes with a wound in his left side, entirely composed, with the expression of a man counting the number of times a specific door has closed on him and arriving at a total he finds difficult to accept. Sirius looked back at him. "Evening, Lucius," he said. "You'll want to get your hands off that wand." The kitchen of Grimmauld Place had been painted yellow at some point after the war, badly, by Sirius himself over a weekend. The woman at the hardware shop had described the color as a lot of yellow in a tone suggesting caution rather than compliment. The imperfections were part of the room now, the coverage uneven at the edges, a roller mark that had dried before he could smooth it. None of it had ever been fixed, because the imperfections were part of the room now, and the room was where everything happened, and changing it would only matter if you thought rooms were more important than the lives inside them. Harry was 34, at the kitchen table with 2 newspapers and a cup of tea. Hermione was across the table, eating toast with one hand and reviewing a briefing document with the other, a red pen making small, precise marks. She was Minister for Magic. She still kept notes in a spiral notepad, the same kind she had used since she was 6, purchased in bulk from a Muggle stationer in North London she had been patronizing for nearly 30 years. Under the table, her daughter Rose was reading. The consensus, reached without discussion, was that a child reading under a table was doing something that made sense on its own terms. Sirius came downstairs at 8:30. His hair had gone fully silver in the year after the graveyard. His left hand ran permanently cold, nerve damage accepted on the grounds that a cold hand was a reasonable price for that particular evening. He sat down, pushed the quibbler back toward Harry without looking at it, and read the Prophet's political section with the attention of someone who had spent 30 years learning how to read between what a ministry press release said and what it meant. "Lily's going to be late," he said. "She's been up since 6, Harry said. "I know. She's working something out." Harry looked through the kitchen window. His daughter sat on the low wall at the garden's far end, cross-legged, with the specific stillness of someone conducting an interior process that required the exterior to be quiet. She was 11 years old, with her grandmother Lily's dark red hair and Harry's eyes, and an approach to problems she had developed entirely on her own. Something Sirius had been watching with the expression he wore when he recognized something. She would not tell anyone which house she hoped to be sorted into. She had a theory about the sorting hat's methodology she had been developing since she was 8, and considered a matter between herself and the hat. "She'll be ready," Harry said. She's always ready, Sirius said. That's not the same thing as being on time. She has 40 minutes, Hermione said, without looking up. They drove to King's Cross. Lily sat in the back with her trunk and her owl and her expression of someone internally occupied but available for conversation if it was worth having. They passed through Little Whinging without announcement. The route had simply resolved itself that direction. And Surrey contained the town the way places you have lived in are contained within your geography as reference points rather than destinations. Harry slowed slightly as they passed the turn. Lily looked out the window. "Dad," she said, "is this where you grew up?" "Part of it." "Which part?" He thought about the kitchen window at number 6, and the light that was always on, the stone dogs at the gate, the fence and the physics of climbing it when you were 2 years old, the garden where he had learned to feel things moving before he saw them, the kitchen table where Sirius had played chess against himself on Thursday evenings while Harry sat on the floor and learned, by proximity, that problems had methods. "The good part," he said. Lily looked at the street for another moment. Then she turned back to her window and said nothing more about it, because she understood that some answers were complete and didn't require extension. Platform 9 3/4 received them the way it always had. Sirius was in his leather jacket. He had worn it to every Hogwarts departure since Harry's first, and would wear it to every one that followed, because some things were not habits, but positions. Harry gave Lily the speech, not word for word, but the shape of it. Pay attention. Don't let the institution think for you. Be useful before you are impressive, because useful lasts and impressive is a performance that has to be renewed. When he finished, she said, "Your job is not to be the most impressive person in the room. Your job is to be the most useful." "Yes," Harry said. "I know, Dad. You've said it since I was 3. It keeps being true." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to things she was deciding whether to agree with. Then she nodded once, with the finality of someone who has made a decision that is going to stay made. Sirius crouched to her level, the same instinct he had always had. This person deserves to be met where they are. "Smart girl," he said. "Runs in the family," she said, and she crossed through the barrier without looking back, because she knew the important people would still be there when she did, and they always were. They stayed. The train pulled away at 11 o'clock. The steam dispersed. The 3 of them stood at the barrier until the last of the red had disappeared around the bend, and then a moment after that, because the moment after was part of it. "She's going to run the world," Hermione said. "She might run it better than us," Harry said. "Distinctly possible," Sirius said. He looked at the empty track for another moment with the expression of a man who has arrived, after considerable distance, at a place he recognizes. Then, "Tea?" Yes, that night, Sirius performed the ward check, 34 years of muscle memory, his hands moving through the sequence before his mind had fully engaged. Harry's house in Hogsmeade, steady. Hermione's flat in Edinburgh, steady. Hogwarts perimeter, the warm, deep pulse of a building full of children that had been keeping them safe for 1,000 years and intended to continue. He checked last, as he always checked last, the charm he had placed on the street in Surrey all those years ago. The house at number 6 had been sold twice since. The family living there now had no idea the ward existed. But the residue remained. Not magic exactly. Not anymore. The love magic that Lily had placed in that street and that Sirius had layered his own work on top of, the 34 years of a family that had grown up inside it, it sat in the substrate of the street the way heat sits in old stone. Long after the fire. Still present. Still warm. Outside, the garden at number 6 had something growing in it that would turn out. In spring, to be lavender, planted by a woman who had chosen it without knowing why, only that it seemed right for the space, only that something about that particular patch of ground suggested it had been waiting for something to grow in it. She was not wrong. The wards were keeping. They always would be. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.